Business news. Now let's return to that story we were reporting on just a little earlier from New York. World leaders gathered there at the United Nations to discuss global challenges. President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, among them. Today, the UN warning that only 15% of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals were actually running to deadline. Let's bring in our New York correspondent, William Denselow. William, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. So why is the world lagging so far behind their own goals?
It's quite striking, Sally, as you just mentioned, 15% of the SDGs currently on track, and many of them, according to the United Nations, are moving into reverse. As to why, well, there has been a serious capitulation in the last few years, namely due to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, having such a detrimental impact around the world. Of course, we see the huge impact it's had on economies, especially in the impact that has had on efforts to alleviate inequalities, to lift people out of poverty. The UN warning that the most vulnerable people still very much most affected, and as things currently stand, by 2030, millions of people could still be in poverty, could still face food insecurity. So they're very much hoping to turn the tide in the next few years before we hit 2030. Of course, it's not just COVID-19 that's being blamed. We've seen the conflicts around the world, extreme climate events also having an exacerbating impact. The message, Sally, as well, is that many of these trends we've seen happen before COVID-19. This is incredibly troubling, and that is why the UN is putting more emphasis, especially on financing, to help reverse these trends, to get nations around the world more capabilities to help achieve these targets. That was something that was very much reiterated by the South African president during his address here in New York.
Yeah, tell us more about what President Ramaphosa had to say. I would imagine that he is regarded as a key voice from the African continent.
Sally, that's absolutely right. The message from President Ramaphosa was that he described this as a vital summit. He said that the SDGs are something that the international community must revive. He very much praised the United Nations when it comes to the focus at this two-day summit, which has been on transforming the global financial infrastructure. The UN has essentially pledged to see a boosting of $500 billion per year, especially for developing nations, to help them get on track with the SDGs. And we heard directly from South Africa's president. He said that in order for the SDGs to be obtainable in just a few years' time, he said that fundamental reform was required, especially when it comes to seeing big changes in terms of relations around the world, and big changes when it comes to global social, economic and political reform.
It's interesting because, of course, we've had the BRICS summit here in Johannesburg recently, and there was a great deal of talk about the South, the political South, and cooperation and changing the way the world works. This $500 billion a year, I understand it's part of a big declaration and a big pledge. Is it clear how it's going to help and where it's being directed? Is that going to be hammered out here this week, or is it likely to be further down the line that those decisions are made?
We're seeing over the next couple of days nations from around the world coming forward, pledging to do their part. So different types of funding and aid going into different types of sectors. So very much a piecemeal approach in the hopes that this will ultimately not just lead up to $500 billion per year, but even more than that. The United Nations essentially saying that that is just the bottom line that they want to see achieved. They're very much hoping for getting over that, considering the fact that the SDGs are so far off the mark. We got a little bit more insight from South Africa's president as to where some of that funding could go. He said that these will come not only into new finances, but he also said that there would be a great deal of improvements when it comes to debt restructuring and more financing to help nations that are particularly impacted by poverty and global hunger. We will, over the next few days, see more and more nations coming forward to provide their insights, their pledges on how to better finance the SDGs. Essentially, though, not just from this SDG summit, but throughout the whole of the UNGA, we're expecting greater pledges on a huge amount of reform, especially on that issue of financing. Of course, as you mentioned, was a huge topic, not just at BRICS, but the G20 too.
Thank you so much. William Denselow coming to us live from New York today.